Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about True Sorcery from Green Ronin Publishing. Now, I can say that this is inspired by the True 20 rules, but it is a complete alternative spellcasting system for use in the D20 OGL school of role-playing games, filling the role of pretty much all the different types of spellcasting that you could have in either a fantasy or even a modern setting. And it bears a passing resemblance to Green Ronin's Psychic's Handbook, the way they handled a skill-based psychic system and the then skill-based generic magic system used in True 20. But this takes it much further. It becomes an incredibly flexible system with an alternative way of looking at magic. And I come away with some really mixed feelings about it. So, the basic premise at the simplest is that this is a skill-based magic system. A spell has a DC, which you have to roll against using your spellcraft check. If you succeed, your spell goes off. Depending on the power of the spell, you will take fatigue damage of a certain level. The more powerful the spell, the more fatigue damage you will suffer. There are ways to mitigate that. They have something in here called spell energy, and spell energy works kind of like the psionic focus does in the psionic system for 3.5, in that it can function passively and actively. Passively, it functions as energy resistance against that fatigue damage that you would suffer from casting a spell. So say you had 5 points of energy, spell energy. If you were going to take 4 points fatigue damage, you would take nothing for, say, a low-level spell. So a spellcaster, casting of moderate level, casting low-level spells, could continue to cast them for a very long time before they suffered any kind of ill effect. And if they were casting a more powerful spell, say one that did 9 points of fatigue damage, if you had 5 energy points, 5 of those points would be subtracted, so you'd only take 4 fatigue, making you go further. You can also use the spell energy actively. For every point you spend, you get a plus 10 to your DC check, to your spellcraft check, to beat the DC of a spell. Which is important because there are spells in here that have a really phenomenally high DC. We're talking spells that have 90, 140. One of the spells in here, which was an example of an absurdly powerful spell, had like a 230 DC. I'm not really sure how you do that even if you were 20th level and other people were helping you, but it was there as an example. The book presents the spellcaster, a generic spellcaster, which would fill any role depending on what you're using for their primary spellcasting stat. And you're going to have a decent con in with this spellcasting class because you're going to be taking fatigue damage. You're going to need hit points. So that's important. It's a much different way of looking at spellcasters. They present the generic fantasy spellcaster and the modern spellcaster, skills, feats, a class breakdown. Then they talk about the essential concepts, some of which I have just touched on. How to choose your spell, spell energy, magnitude. Now, magnitude are the different levels of spellcasters as far as they're a rough bracket of how much spell energy they have and what kind of spells they can tackle. And these are dabbler, students of magic, first magnitude, second magnitude, third magnitude, and the rare and vaulted fourth magnitude, which are like 20 level epic people. Dabbler is obvious. It's a person that just touches on spellcasting. These are kind of things that like other classes might pick up as opposed to being a full-blown spellcaster. Student of magic is the base first level of skill that a caster in this system has. Caster level, spell failure, results of rolls. Pretty much, then we go into spell format, which describes the way a spell is written. How to augment it, because all the spells start at a very basic level, and then you can augment them. For example, pretty much all spells that do an energy damage are going to do 1d4 at like a 5-foot range. You want them to go further, the DC goes up. You want them to do more than 1 die 4, the DC go up. You want them to do a die 6 instead, the DC goes up. You see my point here? So the DC quickly climbs, but say at the end of the day, you don't have a lot of, your spell energy is low, you don't want to risk a lot of fatigue, you can drop your spell into a very basic level on the fly and have a better chance of succeeding. A lot of flexibility here. Then they talk about cooperative magic and proximity magic. Proximity magic is the kind of thing if you're near an energy source, particularly important if you're doing divine magic, say you're near a temple or a holy site, something like that, or near something that is antithetical to your faith, might have an adverse effect on your spellcasting. Spell descriptions. Now, when they talk about the spell descriptions, they're very basic. Use like Fire Lore. Fire Lore is a very basic spell, but you can use it by different types of augmentation to create any fire spell that you could imagine. Another interesting thing is every time you take a spell in this game, and again they're broad, you don't get a lot of them. You'll be taking, they're almost like feats in that regard. You're not going to get a lot of spells, but they can have a great deal of flexibility. But every time you choose one, there's usually an associated benefit. For example, if you take one that has about charming people, you may get a boost to your bluff and intimidation checks. So each spell, most of them, well, not all, everyone, but most of these spells have a continuous side effect that benefits you because you've chosen them. And for me, this is probably where I have the hardest problem. So you have this really incredibly flexible spell system that would let you take a Fire Lore spell, for example, and create any kind of fire-based thing you could imagine on the fly. You find yourself in a situation and you need to take out something that with fire, and it's 100 feet away, and it's just one individual, and they're behind a barrier. You can customize a spell. Boom! You're good to go, as long as you can make that DC check. That's the problem for me, because I see this system breaking down into one of two options. The first option is the player playing the spellcaster comes up with a group of go-to spells. These are the spells they use on a regular basis, and they just use them over and over again. To me, that isn't much different than selecting spells in a conventional 3.5 magic system. The second problem is, if someone needs to make a custom spell on the fly, the game goes woof, and it just stops. No one else is going to do anything while this spellcaster, the player playing the spellcaster, tries to figure out what they want to do with their spellcasting. You've just brought everything to a screeching halt while you decide how you want to design a spell on the spot. I see that as a major flaw. To me, that just seems... it would destroy the narrative. It would take fun away from other people, in my opinion, because they're going to be sitting there twiddling their thumbs while you're coming up with a spell. The book also covers magic items, of course, how to make them, and they break them into least items, lesser items, minor items, moderate items, and major items. And examples of everything, a number of different items that you would notice and recognize from the 3.5 OGL. Then they talk about taint, how do you take in negative consequences to boost your ability to cast spells. Also, you can add things to spells to make the DC lower. For example, most spells have a single component, material, verbal, somatic. But if you add more components, and if you add, let's say, an XP component to a spell, it becomes easier to cast, because you're making it more difficult to do for yourself. That does balance things off slightly. Then they talk about how to use True Sorcery in Thieves' World, True Sorcery in Iron Heroes, and to use True Sorcery in a actual true 20 sorcery game, a fantasy game, or modern setting. Then they also have a spell reference tables, spellcasting steps, blending spell summary, spell building worksheet. Now the blending spell part is kind of cool. You can actually take two spells and combine them together. You could take acid and fire and put them together. And because it's a DC base, all you're doing is upping the difficulty of casting a spell, but you're not basically having to, reinvent the wheel. You're just kind of merging with traffic and you keep on going. I think this is fascinating. The level of work and detail done in this was phenomenal. It's not flawless. They talk about the fly spell, which starts out as basically as levitation. And if you want to actually fly, it adds a plus 30 to your DC. But then they actually give a write-up for the true sorcery version of the fly spell, which is, standard from the OGL. And they don't put in the plus 30 DC that they just spoke about paragraphs before. Now, I don't know if I missed something, if I just didn't get it, but I went over that section repeatedly to try to figure out where I screwed up, and I couldn't. It just looks like they forgot to put that plus 30 DC spell cost in. So there seemed to be some editing inconsistencies in here, and I didn't catch all of them, and so that makes me a little concerned. And I'm concerned by the fact that this is a whole lot of work. This is a 130-something page book. To my mind, doesn't do enough for me to want to replace the standard OGL spellcasting system. And if I want an alternative spellcasting system, I'll just use the psionic system. I've already got one. Yeah, it's not skill-based, it's point-based, but that's okay. Now, someone mentioned to me today, and I didn't know this, that the Slayer's D20 for Big Eye, Small Mouth has a similar skill-based concept. So I may actually get a chance to read get my hands on that and read it so I can see how it compares. See if it's a little closer to the OGL for my flavor and not quite as far as this skill-based system's gone. Now, if you're looking for a challenging magic system, one that really pushes the bounds of what you can do under the OGL, I would recommend taking a look at this. If you want something that's a little less out there, I would suggest checking out Everstone, the Blood Legacy, which uses a skill-based system to a certain extent. It's not as deep as this. It's a little more reined in, if you would. I can't say good or bad on this. I can't even call this a review. I'm basically just talking about it. I'm giving you an overview. I think you're really going to need to read this book for yourself and see how it plays. Now, I've only read the book. I have not used it in play. I don't want to. But if anyone who sees this has ever used True Sorcery in play, I want to know what's it like when the rubber meets the road. How did your group use this? What were your experiences? Because I'd love to hear these details. And if the details are lengthy, please do a video response. I'd like to hear what people have to say about this, because it's a nice idea. The level of work that went into this was profound. I give props to Green Ronin for taking the effort to really come up with a unique way of looking at spellcasting. But for me, I don't think it's worth it. And it just isn't something that I have any interest for at the moment, and I'm having a hard time imagining that I'm ever going to.